Hi, and welcome back to Ask a Midwife Anything. This is the first official video with some educational information. And what I'd like to start with today is all about dating a pregnancy and dating ultrasounds to determine due dates. The most common thing that we use to determine a patient's due date and how far along they are is using the first day of their last menstrual period. This is very accurate and what most people end up using to determine when their due date is going to be. Now, there are people that fall outside of those bounds. So people who have really long cycles and typically tend to ovulate later, the first day of their last menstrual period is not going to line up with actually how far along they are. If people have really irregular periods, they're not getting a period every month. Sometimes people come in and they only get a period every 3 months. And so that can cause there to be a discrepancy in the due date and actually how far along someone is if we use the first day of the last menstrual period. And then there are people who just have no idea when the first day of their last period was and weren't tracking or monitoring it. So what we will do in everybody's case is get a dating ultrasound to confirm a due date. And ideally, the best time to do this is when someone's about 7 weeks along. This gives us a little bit of wiggle room if we're not quite exactly as far along as we think they are. So if the patient's a little bit farther along than their last menstrual period would suggest, then we still catch them in that nice window where we can still order everything. They're not going to miss anything, especially with regards to genetic screening. And so if they're a little bit further along, it doesn't create a big issue. On the other side, if they're not quite as far along as we think they are, and maybe they're only in their 6th week, it also works out well because typically you will see fetal cardiac activity. So you'll see the heart beating on ultrasound in that 6 weeks. So if we're a little bit earlier than 7 weeks and in that 6 week, we usually still will be able to see what we need to see and lets us know that it's a viable pregnancy. Where it gets a little bit uneasy for some people is if we're doing ultrasounds much earlier than 6 weeks. So if someone's actually 4 or 5 weeks pregnant, we're really not seeing what we need to see. We're not seeing that heart beating in order to confirm that it's a viable pregnancy. And this can be really difficult for people, especially if they think they're farther along and measurements are showing that they're earlier. This usually requires that we do some blood work and we follow up on some things, which we will talk about in another video here. But that is typically how pregnancies are dated, either by the first day of your last menstrual period or by the dating ultrasound. Now, if you go and have a dating ultrasound and there is a very big difference in the due dates, for example, if the first day of your last menstrual period gives you a due date of, let's say, August 20th, but you go and have an ultrasound and it says, no, actually, you're not quite as far along as you think you are, and your due date's actually the 28th, then we typically would change that to the ultrasound due date. And there are different cutoffs for this. So if the pregnancy is earlier than 9 weeks, that difference has to be greater than 5 days. So if you think your due date is August 20th, and then they give you a due date of August 23rd, that's still within that 5 days. And so we typically stay with the due date based off the last menstrual period. It's once you get more than 5 days different that then we would change it. Now, this also changes a little bit if you're farther along than 9 weeks. So once you're out of that 9 weeks, then we go to a full 7 days. It has to be greater than 7 days. And so this is why it's very important that we get ultrasounds as early as we can in that 7th week, because the dating is so much more accurate. As you get further along and baby starts to take on more of the genetic characteristics from its parents, for example, some babies are going to have longer femurs, some babies are going to have bigger heads. And so therefore dating gets less accurate as you have more of those genetic factors that are playing into it, as opposed to when it's just a teeny tiny little bean in week 5, 6, and 7, you have less variation, and so dating is far more accurate. And when they do the dating, what they're actually measuring is something called crown rump length, which is exactly like it sounds. It's from the crown, top of what will eventually be the baby's head, to rump, which will eventually be the baby's butt. And so we're measuring that, and they plug that into a calculator that, spins it through and gives you a suggested due date. Hope this was helpful. If anybody has questions about how we date pregnancies, how the dating ultrasounds work, I would love to hear. We'll talk a little bit in some other videos about what happens if dating is done too early. All right, have a great day.